You ever have one of those moments where you hear a term you've never heard before, and the second you hear it, it just instantly clicks with you? Virtue signaling had that effect on me. The second I heard that expression, I knew exactly what it was like. Several years ago, I saw an article on what's going on in America's public school system, and the article was called The Republic of Emotion. And I thought, perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what we've become. Had the same experience just a couple days ago on Instapundit when I was looking at a link to an article by Heather MacDonald, the last living journalist. And she said that the reaction to Donald Trump leaving the hospital was what she called a violation of maximal risk aversion. Now, that's not quite as trippingly off the tongue as virtue signaling, but a violation of maximal risk aversion. In other words, what Donald Trump had done by leaving the hospital early in the minds of some people was he had violated the idea that our life should be about avoiding as much risk as possible, that nothing is more important than minimizing risk to our own self and our own health. And I realized, when you get right down to it, maximum risk aversion is another word for cowardice, really. I mean, when you go outside the door, you are going to face risks. And the way to maximize risk aversion, to make sure that nothing happens, is to lock yourself in the room and have yourself in a padded cell with a nice padded suit on and in your bubble, and people can slide sterilized food paste underneath your door, and you will live as long as possible because you have maximized your aversion to risk. Steve, I've just finished a number of scripts on America's Forgotten Heroes and John Paul Jones, Frank Luke, The Moral Courage of Booker T. Washington, Taffy 3, and I'm just now finishing on the Doolittle Raiders. And what these 20-year-old men experienced, the living hell that they experienced for those that got trapped behind the lines in China, broken legs, walking for days and days and days. It simply boggles the mind. But I begin to realize that all of the trends in our culture, especially including to this reaction to COVID-19, is predicated on the idea that nothing bad can happen to me, that no matter what, the job of society is to make sure that I live as long as possible, no matter what the circumstances. And that's the important qualifier. All of us want to live as long as possible. All of us would like to live rich, full lives. We're not talking about living long, rich, full lives. We're talking about living long lives. And I think that Heather MacDonald really hit it on the head, that what Trump did was in some way, I think it was to me anyway, kind of an act of courage to say, listen, yes, it's a serious problem, but we have to get on with our lives. People die in automobile accidents and we still go driving to places because we have to. What do you think about this idea of Trump violating the tenet of maximal risk aversion?
I can answer that in one word: leadership. That's exactly what it is. Damn leadership. It's nice to see for a change. Wow. And I don't mean from Trump. I just mean generally. There's a lot to get into here. The first thing I want to say is there is this, and this especially goes to the political response here. There is this, I'm not sure what the word is I'm looking for, this conceit that there was some perfect response, some finely tuned thing we could have done. And
nobody died.
Yeah, and 200,000 people would not have died. And that's simply not true. What we have here is a very infectious bug, which, if I can steal, I think this is your phrase, Bill, that is a very picky eater. And we live in a country that is older than it has ever been. The fastest growing age cohort in this country are people 80 years and older, because we're just living longer, and generally we're living healthier. The next fastest growing age cohort is 70 to 79. We have an aging population because people are living longer, healthier lives. But COVID has about a 5% mortality rate for those infected in those two age cohorts. So a tiny fraction of 1% for anyone younger than that, and essentially zero for anyone under the age of 20. So it's a picky eater that is going after the fastest growing segment of our population. It also likes people who are obese, and we are one of the most obese countries in the world. This is an issue. It's something we need to think about as we move forward after this particular pandemic is over. And really, we got the bad luck of the draw here. Had COVID hit in 1918 instead of the Spanish flu, it hardly would have killed anybody because there weren't that many people 70 years and older in this country, and we were a much fitter country 100 years ago as well. It just wouldn't have found nearly as many victims. So this idea that if Trump had done everything that they're saying now with 2020 hindsight that nobody would die, it just isn't true. There is no way you save all of these lives with some magic formula. It doesn't exist. But to get back to your point, and this is the last thing I want to say, Evel Knievel, I looked this up in between segments, was born in 1938. And people born in 1938 had a life expectancy at birth of about 65 years. Evel Knievel, who broke every bone in his body, a lot of them more than once, pursuing thrills, died of natural causes at the age of 69 years old.
Why did Evel Knievel do what he did, Steve?
He wanted to. It was good. It was risky. It made him alive.
Wouldn't he have lived longer if he hadn't done those things?
He wouldn't have been Evel Knievel. He would have been some guy on a sofa.
That's it right there. You nailed it right there.
Yep.
That's it exactly. It wouldn't have been Evel Knievel.
Yeah.
You nailed it. Now, I'm not saying everybody has to be Evel Knievel, but I'm saying you should be allowed to be if you want to be. Scott, the simple question really that all of this stuff boils down to, is there anything more important than the length of your life, than your lifespan? Is anything more important than you living as long as possible?
You know, there's a William Wallace quote on the tip of my tongue that I'll preserve, and those who know it can recite it to themselves. I think that we have this kind of, this MRA syndrome here. The breach of MRA is the most offensive thing, that we would behave in a manner that would seem by some people to be irresponsible, imprudent. But in a previous age, people would have looked at it as just normal life. We talked about on our backstage episode that's available to members at BillWhittle.com, we discussed this idea of maybe we've gotten to a point in society where, because there's not a need for the kinds of people who take bold risks, physical risks, and moral risks for that matter, that society has kind of conspired to tamp that down. We've gone from generations of people who, to speak metaphorically, were on a battleship, and they had to be ready to man their weapons and to do any other role that was required for the security of the battleship. And now we're on a cruise ship. We're on an ocean liner where somebody else is taking care of how everything runs. And I haven't the slightest concern nor knowledge about how the engine's running or what to do if something catches fire, other than to follow the instructions of the PA system, when they tell me where to go. And so I think when you develop, we've talked about this before, it's the downside of prosperity and developing security that's been unheard of in human history. It gives birth to a generation or more of people who are utterly incapable of acting with boldness or defending themselves and others when the need arises. And it doesn't have to be something that is a physical peril. I mean, when you were talking about that, Bill, all I was thinking of, how many people are there right now within the sound of my voice, as they used to say on radio, who know that there is something they should do. Quit that job, start a business, take a risk, learn a new skill, ask her to marry you. And they hold back because of fear of what could go wrong, instead of taking the risk because of the glory of what would happen if it succeeds.
Just as a follow-up, Scott, just as strange timing, but just before we recorded this show, you found a video in your feed that I think is really indicative of what I'm talking about. You don't have to show it. Could you just describe it to people?
Yeah, and this was retweeted by Dana Lash, and it was our friend Dana Lash, and this came from the original Twitter account with somebody named Darren Grimes. I don't know where he got this, but it appears to have been recorded somewhere in England, or at least the speaker in the video has a British accent. And it is a view of the back of the room at a funeral, and the chairs are all it appears to be about 8 to 10 feet apart. And as the speaker starts speaking, there's the widow sitting kind of in the middle of the front of the room, and a man on her right, who I take to be her son, picks up his chair and moves it over next to hers and sits down next to her and puts his arm around her. Then the person on the other side of her picks up his chair and moves it over and comes over to comfort her. And then shortly thereafter, as a third guy is beginning to pick up his chair and move it over next to a woman who's sitting 10 feet away from him, a man in a suit walks up from the back of the room and instructs everybody that they have to maintain social distance. And they spread their chairs apart again. I happen to know, because I talked to a funeral director recently at a funeral that I preached, that because many funerals these days are streamed live on the internet so that people who can't be there can be at the funeral virtually, that funeral directors can lose their license if they don't appear to be observing proper social distancing and other CDC guidelines. And so as a result of that, this widow sits alone in the presence of mortality and death, and not an arm around her shoulder, at least not there in the room.
I'm not going to have many people watching this show who sympathize with the funeral director. They're not going to have many people who are watching this show who think that the son did the wrong thing by breaking social distancing to go and sit next to his mom. The son went and sat next to his mom because that was the right thing to do. It was the human thing to do. It was the necessary thing to do. And if the son and the mom both died of COVID-19 as a result of that action, then that was still the right action. It was the appropriate, correct, human, natural emotion, and it required not courage, but just a fundamental humanity. If you're one of those people who think that the policies of the government that force people at a funeral home to sit 10 feet apart from each other so that they don't have a chance of spreading a disease that kills that kills 1% or 2% of the 80-year-olds that happen to get infected by it, if you don't think that son did the right thing, then there's something fundamentally wrong with you. This idea is very simple. Life is not about duration. It's not about length. It's about volume. It's about how much life can you put into the time you have on this earth, how many experiences, how many connections, how many emotions, how many highs, how many lows. It's not about duration. It's about volume. And this idea that everything that as long as we get a chance to live longer, it doesn't matter what else is done to us. It doesn't matter if we have to spend the rest of our lives behind masks. It doesn't matter if we have to spend the rest of our lives in our houses. It doesn't matter if we never go to movie theaters again. It doesn't matter of any of this stuff. If you're one of those people that believe that, you may in fact live a long life, but you will live a life that is so less alive than the lives of other people who are willing to understand and accept risks. There's an interesting situation where people are able to judge things much better than experts. I'll spend a whole episode on this once, but basically the idea is that large numbers of people come much better conclusions than small numbers of experts. It has been proven again and again and again. And what I find is that the American people and people around the world, through the experience of their own, have come to a very reasonable conclusion about this, and it's a very different conclusion than the conclusion that's being forced on us by people like Governor Gavin Newsom and like the people that forced that son to go sit 10 feet away from his mother while they're both grieving the loss of their husband and father. The bureaucrats and the rule makers and the other people that are using this to grab power are doing it on the backs of people's fear of dying and their fear of things. And they are actually doing everything in their power to turn up the fear. And the reason I'm talking about this episode is that if you have courage, if you have a set of beliefs, if you have a religious system, whatever it takes, and you are no longer worried about your personal existence being the most important thing in the world, then life gets much, much, much easier and much more fun. Much easier and much more fun. There are worse things that can happen than the end of Bill Whittle. There are worse things that could happen to the planet than my personal demise. Once you come to accept that, everything gets very simple. I don't do stupid things, and I'm not asking people to do stupid things, but I am saying if we continue down this path of believing that the ultimate virtue is to minimize the risk to ourselves, then we are going to end up with the kind of society that we deserve. And it's going to be a society where nobody does anything, and we live in our little cubicles, and we live as long as possible, and our lives are utterly meaningless. For Steve Green and Scott Ott, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week right here on Right Angle.